Welcome to the Molecules and Minerals podcast. I'm Stephen Goldman. I'm a former trial lawyer, corporate director, and biotech investor. I'm here today with Yuval Cohen, PhD. He's the CEO of Corbus Therapeutics Holdings, Inc. Based outside of Boston, Massachusetts, Corbus is a clinical stage biotech company with a number of upcoming catalysts this year. Corbus's pipeline includes CRB-701, the next-generation antibody-drug conjugate, or ADC, that targets the expression of Nectin-4 on cancer cells. Corbus is currently focused on advancing CRB-701 in treating two forms of cancer: head and neck squamous cell carcinoma and cervical cancer. Corbus presented encouraging phase 1 and 2 monotherapy data in CRB-701 at the recent European Society for Medical Oncology, or ESMO, in Q4 of 2025. The data included unconfirmed monotherapy objective response rate of 47.6% in head and neck squamous cell cancer and 37.5% ORR in cervical cancer. In addition, CRB-701 had a very favorable safety and tolerability profile. While this data is still early, this is potentially best-in-class monotherapy data. Updated CRB-701 monotherapy results in both head and neck and cervical cancers will be presented at the upcoming 2026 American Society of Clinical Oncology, or ASCO, at their annual meeting to be held May 29th to June 2 in Chicago. In addition to being tested as a monotherapy, CRB-701 is being tested in combination with PD-1 checkpoint inhibitor Keytruda. CRB-701 combination data with Keytruda in first-line head and neck squamous cell carcinoma patients is expected in Q4 of this year. It will be significant to see how this combination clinical data compares to the competition. This may be of particular importance given the recent Genmab acquisition of Merus's petosemtamab, still in phase 3 clinical studies in head and neck squamous cell carcinoma, for $8 billion. The FDA has granted fast-track designations for CRB-701 for both head and neck and cervical cancers. On April 7th, Corbus announced broad alignment with the FDA on a second-line registrational path for CRB-701 for head and neck squamous cell carcinoma in a single randomized controlled study exploring efficacy and safety compared to physician's choice chemotherapy, with potential accelerated approval using ORR as a primary endpoint and potential full approval on overall survival benefit. As well, there's been general alignment with the FDA on a second-line registrational path in cervical cancer as a single randomized controlled study, again exploring efficacy and safety compared to physician's choice chemotherapy, or TIVDAC, with potential accelerated approval using ORR as a primary endpoint and potential full approval granted on overall survival benefit. Corbus will continue interactions with the FDA to finalize a protocol for the registrational studies. Corbus expects to initiate a registrational trial testing CRB-701 in second-line head and neck squamous carcinoma in mid-2026. So by way of some background, Corbus in-licensed CRB-701 from CSPC Megalith Biopharmaceuticals in China. CSPC itself is currently testing CRB-701 in a large phase 3 clinical study treating cervical cancer. Corbus' second important investigational drug asset is CRB-913, which is a highly peripherally restricted oral small molecule CB1 receptor inverse agonist for the treatment of obesity. It has a mechanism of action which is different than the GLP-1s, which appears to materially improve safety and tolerability, including reducing GI adverse events observed in the GLP-1 class, as well as avoiding sarcopenia muscle loss. On December 11th, the company announced top-line clinical results from a double-blinded, placebo-controlled SAD-MAD phase 1A study with CRB-913 and highlights included weight loss of 2.9% at 14 days, a very favorable GI profile with no reports of vomiting, constipation, or nausea. It also demonstrated a very favorable neuropsychiatric assessment. Corbus has also initiated a phase 1b dose range finding study called Canyon 1 with CRB-913, and the phase 1 study will follow 240 U.S. subjects randomized into four arms over a 12-week treatment period followed by a 4-week safety follow-up. Top-line data from the Canyon 1 phase 1b study is expected to be released this summer. Corbus trades on the NASDAQ exchange as CRBP. It currently has a market cap of approximately $180 million US. And after completing a $75 million financing in Q4 2025, the company had $163 million cash or equivalents as of December 31 and has a stated cash runway into 2028. So Yuval, thank you so much for agreeing to be my guest today. And for those unfamiliar with you and the Corbus story, can you tell our audience a little about yourself as well as Corbus's history?
Stephen, first, thank you for having me. This is my first ever podcast, so I'm excited. A little bit about myself. I am one of the 3 original co-founders of Corbus. We started this company as a very small private company in 2014. The company went public in 2015. My background, I'm a scientist by training, so did my PhD in Paris at the Curie Institute, focusing on the molecular biology of cancer or aspects of it. Never thought I would be in oncology drug development. I initially worked in inflammation, and of course we have an obesity program, but somehow I also ended up in what I studied for, which is oncology. Corbus has had a roller coaster history. We started with 3 people. I think $10 million was our seed round, Stephen. We then placed all our bets on a single asset, a very, very novel, never tried before mechanism of action in rare inflammatory diseases. Took that to a phase 3, in fact, a series of almost parallel phase 3s. That was probably a $400 million journey. Sounds about right. And in late 2020, we were all working from home. It was the height of COVID. We flipped those cards, and one after the other, these phase 3s were all negative. At the time, there were probably 200 of us. And so that was quite the experience. That was quite the experience, to say the least. That's not something I recommend people go through if they can avoid it. We shrank dramatically, almost traumatically. We basically let go of 90% of our employees in a short period of time. We still occupy the same offices, Stephen, because the rent is so wonderfully competitive. And so there are fewer than 40 of us in 35,000 square feet.
Wow.
It's a very unusual office set, and we love it. And then what saved us is we had sufficient money in the bank, as it were, in order to go out there and acquire a new pipeline. We all looked at each other and said, let's do this. Let's see if we can bring this back. And so probably $200 million later, we find ourselves with a very peculiar pipeline. We have an asset, as you pointed out, in oncology in the clinic, which is an ADC, an antibody-drug conjugate. And we have an asset that could not be more different. It's an oral daily pill based on a small synthetic molecule targeting obesity. And other than the fact that obesity and oncology both start with the letter O, they have absolutely nothing to do with each other. And I think what's interesting is these two disparate programs, these two completely different mechanisms of action for two unrelated conditions, are both reaching a their own sort of inflection points pretty much at the same time. Early summer at ASCO, we will have data on our ADC in head and neck and cervical that will really be highly informative. It will tell us, tell you what do you do with a drug like this? Where do you take a drug like this clinically, commercially? And just a few short months after that, in late summer, we will have our readout again, as you pointed out at the introduction. We'll have the readout for a pretty large first in patient obesity study that will again be even more binary. That study, Stephen, will tell us is, do we have a drug in obesity, the first of its kind, in a sense? Or is this yet another drug targeting this receptor that isn't going to make it? So the next several months are not going to be boring. We are really excited and really looking forward to them.
So let's start with your cancer drug, 701. So as I mentioned in the introduction, I see you acquired the drug from this Chinese company called CSPC, and I understand that was back in 2023. So perhaps you could tell us about the deal itself, the terms of the deal, why you did it, and where do you think this drug can be used by Corbus?
Remember, we nearly died
Right.
in early 21. We had no pipeline. There was nothing. We just had one drug, and it died, as it were. And so we went shopping, and it's an interesting sort of journey, Stephen. And I think your audience may find it interesting. We first looked at assets, drug candidates in the US and in Europe and in Israel, which are very sensible places, sort of the traditional hunting grounds for companies looking for assets to license. Because remember, we're talking about licensing rather than acquisition. We don't really buy a drug. And what we found was in our price bracket, right? We were on a limited budget. In our price bracket, what we saw was either very, very, very early science projects, and we actually brought one of those in. Since then, sort of haven't moved it forward, but it was either science projects from great universities, but it's a science project, or there were assets where there was something horribly broken about them. Sort of, they had a horrible tox issue, or they couldn't be formulated. There was a blemish, which explained why they were in the price bracket we're looking at. Anything that was good was exceptionally expensive, almost irrationally expensive, I must say. It's interesting, a bunch as an aside, since this is a podcast, it's a bit more conversational. As an aside, some of the assets we looked at back then that we said, look, we think this valuation just makes no sense, have since actually disappeared. They've just failed. And the last place we looked at was this new emerging marketplace of China. We started talking to CSPC in 2022. That's probably one of the earliest Western Chinese conversations that were taking place. We consummated the deal, as it were, on Valentine's Day 2023. Again, very, very early. I remember, Stephen, at the time, investors would still ask, are you comfortable with the Chinese data? Are you comfortable with Chinese regulatory issues, etc.? Questions that today nobody asks anymore. A reminder to you and your audience, last year, 50% of all licensing deals in pharma came from China. My guess is this year will probably be the majority. And so we brought the ADC in. It's a very classic Chinese pharma deal. And what I mean by that, they retain China and Chinese associated territories. That's very normal. Um, we quote unquote purchased or licensed in North America, Europe, and Australia, which again is very typical. And the deal was done at the time. There was no data had been generated in the West, right? That was our job. And um, they were just starting clinical studies in China. There was no clinical data yet, just starting. Um, but they had cleared the IND in the US and the IND in China. And so the upfront payment was sub $10 million.
Wow.
Yep. Um, and um, and the milestones add up to a lot more than that, but they're the typical sort of back-ended deal, which is pretty classic. You know, they're regulatory milestones and then commercial milestones. One of the interesting things about this, so for your audience, this is a Nectin-4 MMAE armed ADC, and there's a whole bunch of them out there in development because one of these is already approved. It's a drug called Padcev. It was actually approved in 2019, if I remember correctly. Um, and so what's so interesting about it is um, we brought this in February 23, and I believe a month later, March or April 23, Pfizer bought Seagen, which is the company that made Padcev, right? They bought Seagen for pipeline, but the sort of the crown jewel of that pipeline was Padcev for, Stephen, you may remember it better than I do. I think it was 43 or 47 billion dollars. It might be 47 billion dollars. It was an extraordinary price tag, which immediately made anything with a Nectin-4 and MMAE interesting, right? That type of price tag can act as quite the validation for value. So if we had waited another month before signing the dotted line, we may not have been able to afford this asset.
Is that also known as Tivdak?
No, Tivdak is another type of ADC entirely. Ironically, though, also developed by Seagen, so it ended up with Pfizer.
Right. Okay.
Tivdak is approved for cervical cancer. Padcev is known as enfortumab vedotin. It is like our drug, an antibody that targets a target on the cell surface called Nectin-4. Like our drug in all ADCs, it then has a little linker, which is a little tail. And at the end of that tail, in our case and in Padcev case and in case of all ADCs, is a tiny little molecule that is a chemotherapeutic agent. We share the same one as Padcev, so we have the same target, we have the same warhead. The difference is our antibodies are different. Even though they're the same target, they're different antibodies. And our what's known as our tail and conjugation technology are radically different. Padcev is a really great drug, but it is an older generation. It's really the first generation of ADCs. My guess is Padcev was first developed probably 20 years ago. Took a while to get to the market, but it's probably a 20-year-old drug. Since then, ADCs have come a very, very long way. And our ADC is one of these newer generation of ADCs. There's a bunch of bells and whistles about it that are markedly different than Padcev.
If we look at head and neck cancer, do we look at Padcev as sort of the standard of care, or what is standard of care currently?
Yeah, so we talked about it a bit in the pre-call. We have a number of very deep scars from our first pipeline and in general that sort of determined our philosophy. And one of the tenets of our philosophy is we really do not like confrontation. We look for swim lanes or indications that are as free from competition as possible. Padcev is approved for bladder cancer, not for head and neck or for cervical. And in bladder cancer, it is highly well established as a standard of care. So much so that in order to compete with it, we reckon you would need to run a study that would be very large, very expensive. You'd have to convince patients and physicians to take a patient and not give them Padcev, but rather give them something experimental. And we figure that's probably a $500 million study. That's how ambitious a study like that needs to be. You're trying to dislodge something that has an almost monopoly on it. That does not appeal to us at all. And so what we like are tumor types, Stephen, where Padcev could have worked, and sometimes there's even clues, experimental clues that it works, but where it's not a competitor. For example, there is a early stage program that was run in head and neck with Padcev, experimental. The data was certainly intriguing, but Pfizer are not moving forward in head and neck with Padcev for a variety of we think, very sensible reasons. They're hyper-focusing on bladder. That's probably going to be a $6 billion market for them. And also, Padcev has an adverse event profile that is well established in bladder, but probably would not do well in head and neck. And in cervical, interestingly enough, Padcev was never tested precisely because of their ownership of Tivdak.
Right. Okay.
So they don't want to, sensibly, they don't want to cannibalize one asset in favor of the other. But conceptually, both of those are attractive, and the data we generated to date has shown us, both us as well as in China in the case of cervical, that there is a genuine clinical signal coming out of these two indications with our ADC.
We talked about the recent Merus deal with Pito at $8 billion for head and neck. I see when they talk about Pito, I usually see the combination data that comes out in combination with Keytruda, which is what you're also looking at. And I believe, if my memory serves me correct, that they had a 63% ORR in head and neck. And so is that what you're aiming at, or do you think you have a shot at doing better because you had slightly better monotherapy results? I mean, I know small numbers, etc., but
Yep. Small numbers, although the numbers are not that different. In other words, we have small numbers and they have small numbers,
yes.
so it's somewhat comparable. We think Maris have done a phenomenal job of execution and strategy, and so a little bit of a segue into head and neck and sort of the competitive landscape there. First, for the viewers, head and neck is pretty simple. It's any cancer you get above your shoulders, pretty much. There are, within head and neck, two types of cancer, and they will become important for the story of both Merus, or what is now Genmab, and those types of drugs, but also potentially for our story. There is a type of cancer called head and neck, and typically, Stephen, the classic patient that presents with head and neck cancer is older. They are typically in their 70s. That's pretty common. They have a history of excessive drinking or excessive smoking. And one day they notice that they have a growth, for example, on their jaw or on their tongue. It's something that's very visible to them. It's something that's very hard to ignore and very odd.
Yes.
And they will pretty quickly end up with an oncologist who will recognize that as head and neck cancer. If they catch it early enough, which often they do, they will surgically remove it, which has its own complications, and then they'll typically clean it up with either localized radiation or chemo, etc. There is, and that's about 50% of patients in the West. It's a lot more in the East because there's a lot more smoking in Asia and etc. That population is actually shrinking. they are tragically, sadly dying off. The youth, you've noticed, Stephen, is not smoking or drinking like previous
Right.
generations, and I'll leave it at
Okay.
that. So what about the other 50% of patients? The other 50% of patients have what is almost a different disease. It's known as oral pharyngeal cancer. Very, very colloquially, it's known as throat cancer. It's pretty accurate. It's a form of head and neck cancer that basically is in your upper throat or your back teeth to the top of your throat type of thing. They are patients who are a lot younger. You're talking now about people in their 40s and 50s and 60s. They did not smoke. They did not drink. And what they experience is a sore throat typically. And Stephen, every one of our listeners has experienced a sore throat. You'll go to your family physician and they'll say, well, maybe you have an allergy or a cold. And then at some stage you go to an ENT and they don't see anything. And at some stage you go to whatever. And then ultimately, hopefully, you end up with an oncologist. And what the oncologist will notice is that in your throat, so it's not something you can see in the mirror, and often behind your tonsils is a growth. And the tragedy of oral pharyngeal or throat cancer is that by the time you finally realize what you have, it tends to have spread around. So 80% of those new cases already metastatic. What's causing it, right? It's not smoking, it's not drinking. What's causing it is a virus, and it's a virus that we hear a lot about. It's the human papillomavirus. It's an endogenous virus to humans, and it is the same virus that causes cervical cancer. The two most common tumor types that are driven by this virus are cervical cancer and, again, colloquially, throat cancer or oral pharyngeal cancer. Human papillomavirus is basically an STD. We don't think of it as an STD because it doesn't really have any symptoms other than when it infects a cell, it hijacks the machinery of a cell, as viruses do. This virus, unfortunately, while hijacking the cell, can trigger a tumor, can trigger an oncological process. And so what does all of this has to do with Merus? And for that matter, the other two companies that are focusing on head and neck. If you have this non-oral pharyngeal, in other words, a general head and neck that's not your throat, that's caused by smoking or drinking, there is a new class of drugs that is super, super exciting, known as the EGFR bispecifics. These are 3 different antibodies. Each antibody binds simultaneously to 2 targets. The one target is always across all 3 of them, something called EGFR. The one company that has it was Merus, which is now Genmab, and that's Pito. The other one is a company called Bicara. The other company is J&J. They have one of those as well. And so it works really well. Bicara and J&J focus only on frontline. Merus started as a second line, saw very encouraging data, dipped their toes in the front line, saw even more encouraging data, and so have them both. But there's another very big difference, which could become very interesting for us. So the smokers and the drinkers don't have a HPV-driven tumor, right? But what about the throat cancer people with the HPV-driven tumor? They have a problem when it comes to these EGFR bispecifics, because what the virus does when it hijacks the cell is it actively suppresses EGFR. It actively suppresses the very target, Stephen, that these really exciting experimental drugs in otherwise head and neck target. So the first thing is these EGFR bispecifics don't work well in the throat cancer or in oropharyngeal or HPV positive. It's all basically the same thing. They work so poorly in that 50% of the population that Johnson & Johnson and Bicara don't even try. They're targeting exclusively what's known as HPV negative head and neck, which again is head and neck except for the throat. Merus is a little bit different. They are attempting to go both after the HPV negative, which is very sensible. That's what their other two peers are doing. But they're also going after the HPV positive. Because of that, their earlier data showed that they do very poorly in the HPV positive. It's not surprising. So I'll give you, for example, an idea of how juxtaposed this is. In HPV negative, so the smokers and the drinkers, what was known as was Peto, the Merus drug, has a response rate in the high 30s, something like that. 36, 37, sounds about right. And that's sensible. The target is there, smoking and drinking, etc. The same drug in throat cancer, in oropharyngeal cancer, which is a viral, which is where you don't have that target, that efficacy I just mentioned drops to 13%. It's a lot less potent. Unsurprisingly, the target's not there. And so the first thing to sort of realize is there are two types of head and neck cancer. The one type works really well with these EGFR bispecifics. The other type, which is 50%, does not work well. That was a very long answer.
Yeah. No, it's a good answer. And the figures of that 36 and 13%, that's in monotherapy?
Correct. That's monotherapy. And then what all three EGFRs also have is frontline. That's an even bigger market. In frontline, they don't do it on their own. They combine efforts with Keytruda, right? Pembro. And because the mechanisms are different, they work very nicely together. And all three have shown really nice data in HPV negative, the smokers and the drinkers. You mentioned 63%, for example, for Peto. But again, here, Peto is the only one, or Merus or Genmab are the only ones that are trying to go after the HPV positive ones as well, the throat cancer. The other two are not even trying. And even here, their efficacy degraded to 50%, right? When it came to those positives. And a lot of that 50% is probably the Keytruda doing some of the heavy lifting. A goodly amount of it. And so one of the interesting things about our data, sort of now to bring it back to Corbus, sort of November of last year at a big oncology conference called ESMO, we showed our first ever data in head and neck. And you mentioned we had an unconfirmed response rate of 47. We had a confirmed response rate of 33. So one of the obvious questions is, where does that all end up, right? The other question was, the study was too early in order to have what's known as durability. It's one thing for a drug to work, but you also want it to actually work for a while. It was just too early in the data set. And both of those questions will be answered simply because it's matured, right? So by the time we're at ASCO, everything's confirmed, we'll have durability. But the most interesting question, or the most fundamental questions we were asked at ESMO, that initial maturing data set, was, okay, you're going for second-line monotherapy in head and neck, so is Peto. Where's the difference? How do you succeed? How do you thrive in the presence of a competitor, especially since Peto is about a year ahead of us? And what we have been talking about publicly is one of the unanswered questions that we will bring to ASCO, Stephen, is something we did not have at ESMO, which was also patient stratification. And patient stratification in head and neck means one thing. It's the HPV positive versus the HPV negatives, right? It's the throat cancer versus the smoking and drinking cancer. And so that data could be very informative. We know that the EGFRs are really strong in the HPV negative, the smokers and the drinkers, but have a real Achilles heel when it comes to the throat cancer, the HPV-driven one. I think a really interesting question would be, how does our drug do between those two populations? And there are two interesting clues out there that are certainly enough to be thought-provoking, right? We'll see what the data looks like, but as a thought exercise, Stephen, I think are worth thinking about. The one is a biological clue. I mentioned before that when the virus hijacks the cell and causes it to become a throat cancer tumor, one thing it does is it suppresses EGFR for its own survival. It's what makes the EGFR bispecifics ineffective. But there's a whole bunch of processes and targets within the cell that the virus hijacks and starts to ramp up. And one of them is, and there's literature out there on this, one of them is Nectin-4. There's a lot more Nectin-4 on cells infected with HPV than not. It's why cervical cancer is such a good target for us. Cervical cancer is driven almost entirely by HPV. Throat cancer, HPV-driven cancer, is very enriched for Nectin-4. The other thing, sort of to be thought provocative, is you talked about Padcev. Padcev is not a head and neck approved, but we talked about the fact that there were some early stage studies with Padcev, sort of exploratory stuff. And there was a second-line monotherapy study with Padcev in 23. The response was okay-ish. It was about 24%. That study, though, did not break down efficacy between HPV positive and negative. So we just have no idea what they saw. But last year's ESMO, they had a poster presentation on Padcev plus Keytruda in frontline, right? Conceptually what we want to do. And this time, they did break down the stratification. So the top line data, the number that sort of people focused on was, regardless of HPV positivity or negativity, the ORR they saw, Stephen, in frontline with Keytruda in head and neck was 39%. It's not bad, but it's not super competitive either, right? But the stratification was fascinating. So in HPV negative, the smokers and the drinkers, the tumor type where the EGFRs work so well, their response rate there was a very, very, very modest 23%. So compare that with Peto at 63%. It's really not exciting. In fact, Keytruda on its own is about 17%. So it really wasn't doing much there. But it's fascinating what happened in the throat cancer, in the oral pharyngeal cancer, the HPV cancer. There, the same drug Padcev with Keytruda, their response rate was 82%.
What?
Yeah. And so 9 out of 11 confirmed responses. And so even Peto in that population is just 50%, right? And so that's very provocative. Remember, those cancer cells, because they're HPV driven, are covered in Nectin-4. It's also conveniently the group where Bicara and Johnson & Johnson are not attempting to target because they know there's a weakness with the EGFR bispecific, and where Peto is at its weakest, right? All of this is wonderfully hypothetical. What it really will depend on is what does our data look like first at ASCO as monotherapy? And if it's informative enough, could that provide us a line of sight towards the end of the year where we'll have our first ever combined data with Keytruda in frontline? And we'll see what the data fits, if it fits this hypothesis or doesn't fit this hypothesis. But it's certainly intriguing. And again, remember that philosophically, we are incredibly conflict averse.
So, and you'll have stratification data in your combination with Keytruda, and you'll have it also at ASCO in your monotherapy stratification.
If there is a bias towards the one type in monotherapy, there will be a bias towards that subtype in the frontline as well. There's no question about it.
Now, I know these are all small numbers, but that's a very interesting result.
The numbers again are similar. So Padcev plus Keytruda frontline was 9 out of 11 responses. Peto plus Keytruda frontline was 4 out of 8 responses.
Right.
So it's small number versus small number.
The monotherapy data it will be very interesting, and I can see why that will be informative. And you are doing a registrational trial in
We'll be starting one, yeah.
starting one in monotherapy. Correct.
Correct. So we shamelessly copy Maris. What they did was very sensible. For that matter, we're also copying what at the time Seagen did with Padcev in bladder. We start with second line because that's where we have data, and and that's where those studies tend to be shorter
Yep.
and
Yep.
smaller. And at the same time, one dips one's toes into the front line, as Padcev did, as Peto did. And if the front line looks intriguing enough, then later on you start a front line as well.
All right. I can see how this is going to be really interesting gear for you, particularly if you show that enormous differentiation with the HPV stratification issue.
I think it will be highly, highly informative. And if that does come about, it could also be one of those very satisfying examples where the hypothesis of the science fits with the clinical observation. But it all boils down to the data. It all boils down to the data.
And are similar studies being conducted in China? I know they've got that large cervical cancer trial. And what about in head and neck? Are they proceeding in a similar fashion there?
So the interest for CSPC so far has been cervical, where we are the same. It's interesting, Stephen. It's for different reasons. Cervical is a rare malignancy in the West. It's a common malignancy in China. It has to do with vaccination for HPV for teenage girls. They are also interested in bladder. In China, Padcev does not have the type of dominance it has in the West, and so it is much more competitive. We are not interested in bladder on our own. Head and neck is an interesting one. It's one of the very rare examples, maybe a unique example, where the Western partner discovered an indication prior to the Chinese licensor. They have yet to disclose publicly if they're going after head and neck. So I think that will be something that will be interesting to see how that evolves.
All right, so let's talk about your 701 in cervical cancer. You also had some very promising early results at ESMO, and you have feedback from the FDA on what a registrational trial will be like. What's the current landscape and the competition, and how do you fit in, and how are you differentiated?
Cervical is interesting. As I mentioned, it's a rare malignancy. It's only about 3,000 to 4,000 women a year in the US that advance to a metastatic stage in second line. The reason, by the way, Stephen, is it's so interesting to compare it with throat cancer. We've talked about how throat cancer is sort of a hidden cancer, right? You can't see it. It's when you have a sore throat, the last thing you think about is, oh my goodness, I've got cancer. So most cases when they're finally detected, it's late. It's very late in the game. Cervical is the opposite because women have hopefully at least annual checkups at the gynecologist, and it's very easy to spot. And so the majority of cervical cancer is spotted, like the majority of non-throat cancer. Early on, there's something that's very visible. Now, in this case, it's visible to the gynecologist, and it's excised and then cleaned around it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's as tragic as throat cancer in the sense that if that was not discovered in time, then by the time it's discovered, it's usually very late in the game. The opportunity is not in frontline necessarily. Frontline is Keytruda plus chemo, and it actually works well. But invariably, it's the failures of the frontline that arrive to the second line where the choices are not ideal. So you have two choices. Chemo, again, with a very, very, very modest single-digit response rate. It really is sort of a last resort. And an ADC, also developed by Seagen that went into Pfizer, as we discussed, called Tivdak. It's a different target, but the same warhead as Padcev. And that is a very challenging ADC. Padcev works in bladder really, really well. Tivdak is very modestly efficacious. The ORR for Tivdak is just 17%. And to make it even more challenging, Stephen, it's a very difficult drug to tolerate. So it has ocular tox, but so do we, and so does another ADC called Elahere. There's a whole bunch of these new ADCs that have ocular tox. But it also has, like Padcev, peripheral neuropathy, and that's very challenging. That's destruction of neurons. It can have very, very severe skin reactions, just like Padcev. And then unique to Tivdak, it also has bleeding. So if you add all of that list and combine it with efficacy that's very modest, it means that in reality, something like 1 out of 5 women in the US who are eligible for Tivdak are actually getting it. What's interesting is it still, even though the number of patients is very small, per patient is a very, very commercially successful drug. Tivdak last year made about $300 million. Its annual list price, as it were, is $466,000. It's one of the more expensive oncology drugs.
Are those US figures, the 300 million annual
Correct.
sales?
The 300 million is US plus Europe. It's the only place it's been used.
Oh, okay.
The price is US. And what we have previously seen, what CSPC has disclosed previously, is efficacy somewhere in the mid-30s. No peripheral neuropathy, much less skin, no bleeding. And so far, again, we'll wait for the ASCO data. It looks like a kind of a markedly differentiated drug. The only drawback to cervical is it's a rare malignancy, right? It's not like head and neck. You're not talking about tens of thousands of patients. You're talking every year about sub 5,000.
Given that 701 has a much greater efficacy, at least, so far presented, and clearly the adverse effects are minimal compared to Tivdak, it seems like this could be a winner for you, assuming that the results come out the way you expect it to have. So we'll have additional results at ASCO, and now these are again monotherapy results.
Correct. And again, lots of caveats, right?
Of course.
So at ASCO, we'll have second-line monotherapy in head and neck, second-line monotherapy for cervical.
If you were successful in getting this drug approved for cervical, it seems like you could probably capture a much larger market because of the profile of the drug.
I agree. Could be one of those, not unheard of, but rare situations where what you end up with, Stephen, theoretically, is not actually competition, but rather you supplant an incumbent, right? The most famous example that comes to my mind, if you remember, Stephen, Vertex had a hepatitis C drug that for about a year was the only game in town. And then it was just entirely eliminated. That drug doesn't even exist on the market anymore.
Yeah.
So you get these sometimes unusual situations that obviously it all has to do with the data, the execution, etc.
Assuming the data is positive for you, what do you hope to get? How would you define success at ASCO?
In which one?
Right now we're talking about cervical.
I think that if we show a differentiated response rate, if we show that our safety profile has not meaningfully changed from last time, right? Nothing new creeped up, nothing scary. If we have insights on durability, I think that will be very, very, very encouraging.
You've announced that you're going to start a registrational trial in head and neck, but you've been silent on cervical. Is there any plans for starting a registrational trial given your recent feedback from the FDA in cervical?
Yes, it's just remember we are 38 of us.
Right.
Um, we couldn't start both at once, even if we wanted to. Just physically, we can't do it. So we are, and there's also a question of
Sure,
resources,
of
right? But
course.
if all goes well, we think we'll be in a position to initiate the cervical one next year. Um, and so it's not parallel; it's more staggered. The cervical one, even though it's a smaller indication, might actually take longer to recruit just because it is an uncommon tumor type. The advantage of an uncommon tumor type is the studies typically don't have to be large either, right? They're sort of a commensurate with how rare the tumor type
Right.
is.
I guess one advantage you may have is the fact that you've got a phase 3 cervical trial ongoing in China.
That is a very significant advantage. Even though we do not combine the data, there are things that the Chinese data set is immensely helpful for. It's a predictor of the future. They are today where we will be, say, in a year's time. Secondly, you can certainly draw and leverage that data for safety. It's additional safety. And thirdly, especially in cervical, if you look at the history of Tivdak, rather than one single registrational study, they did two. They did a single arm for accelerated approval and then a controlled one for the final authorization. That's something that doesn't appeal to us. And frankly, I'm not even sure if FDA goes for that these days. But if you look at their first study, the accelerated approval one, it was just 101 women, and only 16 of those women were actually in the US. The rest was supplemented by Europe, primarily Eastern Europe, and Asia. And so one could imagine potentially then leveraging Chinese data a bit more than we would normally do, precisely because it's a rare indication. Whereas in head and neck, that's not really something we would need to do or even want to do.
I did take a peek at clinicaltrials.gov looking at the Chinese trial. So it looks like they only started the trial, I believe, last fall. So I guess we're a ways away before seeing any data, and I believe their plan is to enroll over 400 women.
One thing I would say is every time we think we've understood how quickly trials can enroll in China, somebody in China surprises us. And so, and remember, it is a relatively common gynecological malignancy.
And it's a big country, so they can enroll fast. Yeah.
It's amazing what you can do with 1.5 billion people.
Amazing.
Yes.
There's going to be a lot of patients treated with the drug in cervical over the next number of years. So I think that'll be interesting for Corbus. So let's switch now to your other uh, main drug candidate, CRB-913. That's a weight loss drug that's not a GLP-1. So do you want to just briefly discuss the different form of mechanism of action that it has and how it's
I feel
differentiated
like
from the
we,
competition? Yeah.
I feel like we almost need a separate podcast just for
Well,
that story.
you're right.
Fair enough. Very briefly, the GLP-1s or incretins are a superfamily of GPCRs or G-coupled protein receptors. They are highly efficacious, wonderfully transformatively efficacious. A simplistic way to think of them is they keep animals alive by regulating our ability to digest food. They tell our brains when we have enough food in our stomachs. They're very gut-centric targets. It's not the only thing they do, but it's a very, very sort of gut to brain axis type of dialogue goes on with GLP-1s in that family. There is a completely separate GPCR in the animal kingdom, anything from a sea sponge upwards, that has nothing to do with this family. And it's an N of one. There's only one of them. It never multiplied into a family. It's known as a CB1 receptor. It too evolved to help animals survive, just like the GLP-1s, in times of starvation. It's not a gut receptor. It really doesn't have to do much with digestion. It is a metabolic receptor. It tells the body once you've ingested the food, whether you're going to burn that food as fuel or store it as fat. Part of what it does is it then talks to the brain and says, right, you've eaten enough. I actually don't need more fuel. And so targeting that receptor has been known for 20 years, more than 20 years, that targeting that receptor using small molecules leads to metabolic changes, appetite suppression, and weight loss. It's one of the most predictable mechanisms of action out there. Every single CB1 inverse agonist ever tested in the clinic led to weight loss. That's not the mystery here. The reason we don't have them is 20 years ago, a whole bunch of big pharma, Sanofi, Pfizer, BMS, Merck, had one of these pills. They were in the clinic. They were showing weight loss. And then the first one to cross the line, Stephen, with FDA was Sanofi, and it was a disaster. FDA said, and I'm simplifying it, and we actually wrote a paper on it. FDA said, you know, we are worried that there could be a potential for psychiatric adverse events. And Sanofi said, no, there isn't. And they started arguing. And you're a trial lawyer. Arguing with FDA is not a productive thing to do, rightly so. And so the whole thing ended in really a catastrophe, not just for that drug that was withdrawn, its application was withdrawn, but the entire class collapsed because it had this stink cloud around it of psychiatric adverse events. And so this thing's dead. This thing's absolutely dead, except one team at NIH comes up with a solution, Stephen, that's almost cartoonish. They go, right, we can just take these things and make them not go in the brain. That should solve the problem, right? Sometimes the simplest solutions are the easiest. And there are two programs like that out there. One belongs to Novo Nordisk. They bought it from a Canadian company for $1 billion in 2023. And one is little old Corbus. And the difference between us and Novo Nordisk's compound is their compound has about 50% reduction in brain levels, right? So it's definitely meaningful, but 50% is still there. Ours is markedly less in the brain. We are at about 2% in the brain compared to Novo at 50%, right? Preclinically, all these things work. They all make mice shrink. That's not a problem. Novo Nordisk were the first in the clinic in 2024, late September 2024. They unveil a 240 patient study, early stage study, and a lot of adverse events. They lose, Stephen, that day, $32 billion worth of market cap. Just to put in perspective how much this program was valued. We're still in mice at that stage. We make it into humans end of last year in a phase 1 SAD MAD. It's a short study. They're mostly healthy people anyway. No red flags on safety, but again, it's a short study. The numbers are small, but it's an important milestone. One intriguing data point is one of the cohorts, Stephen, is purposefully individual with obesity. You do that for safety reasons. You want to make sure it's safe in large people. And in 2 weeks, they lose weight. They actually lose a lot of weight. They lose almost 3%. So that was an intriguing data signal. At the end of this summer, we will have our own 240 patient study. Very, very analogous to the Novo one. And it's going to be one of those wonderfully binary things. Either this thing is not safe, just like the Novo drug in the previous drug, in which case this thing's dead and no one's ever going to hear about it again. Or it sails through. In other words, the hypothesis is right. If you can keep it to such an extreme degree outside the brain, you've actually solved the problem. Why does that matter? And why did Novo lose $32 billion that day? Because should that be the case, if this thing survives it, then it is the only drug we have at the moment, pretty much anywhere, that is an oral daily drug that leads to weight loss that is not an incretin family. That's not a GLP-1 superfamily.
Yes.
And that in and of itself is very noteworthy. The adverse events, the GI adverse events with CB1 are much milder than the GLP-1s. That's a big problem for GLP-1s. 20% of patients don't respond to GLP-1s. They just physiologically, there's something wrong with the receptor. Those patients could respond to a different type of drug. 23% of patients respond to GLP-1s, but the reaction is so bad that the GI adverse events are so horrific for them that they just give up. Again, something milder could be very impactful. And lastly, you could take a CB1 drug and actually combine it with a GLP-1 and increase the efficacy of both. And that's important because of the 60 or so percent of patients who do respond, not all of them lose as much weight as they want. And there's a bunch of other things you could do with it. So end of summer is, if you think the ADC is not going to be boring, end of summer is definitely not going to be boring because it is just such an unusual binary event. And there's just no way of calling it. There's just no way of calling it. Everything so far has behaved really nicely. If it does survive, no one else has one of these things. The Novo drug is effectively dead.
So you presented 14-day data, and the 2.9%, almost call it 3% weight loss was actually significantly more than the GLP competition, including Novo Nordisk, I think, drug was, I think, under 1% at 14 days. And the safety profile at 14 days looked really promising.
The weight loss is, especially because the weight loss we saw was not associated with GI adverse events.
Yes.
Stephen, you could lose 10% of your weight loss in 2 weeks if you spend those 2 weeks in the bathroom. And so that's not very helpful. And that's not
Sure.
a drug.
Of
It's not going to be
course.
a drug.
Of course.
So in our case, the GI adverse events were remarkably mild. That's not what was driving the weight loss. What was driving the weight loss were patients or volunteers reporting to us, I'm not as hungry as before. I don't have that food noise as before. And one of the remarkable things about this mechanism, but for that matter, the GLP-1s as well, is you can influence appetite by targeting the parts of the body that are outside the brain. GLP-1 does that. CB1 does that in our case. Bariatric surgery, right? Stomach stapling decreases your appetite. You're not stapling your brain. The brain really does talk to the periphery, and it's one of these really beautiful examples where a drug that is barely detectable, if any, in the brain, its hallmark was, I'm not feeling hungry.
And what about sarcopenia and muscle loss?
It's an open question to what extent the GLP-1s actually cause it versus just the weight loss that they elicit. What we do know is that back in the day, that first generation, they looked at lean mass loss, which was the way they could measure it, and they didn't see anything out of the ordinary. There's also some very beautiful animal work out of NIH, specifically looking at effects on muscle and muscle wasting with CB1 drugs, and they saw nothing. It is completely orthogonal. It is a completely different drug than the GLP-1. So we'll see. Our study's 3 months long in terms of treatment. We are going to measure lean mass on some of these participants, but honestly, you're not going to see much anyway in 3 months. Sarcopenia, if it does happen, tends to take longer than that.
So we've been talking for quite a while. And it's
We
been
may be breaking a record here today, Stephen. We're 9 minutes away from the all-time record.
it's been fascinating. And I just want to know, firstly, is there anything else that you want to cover that we haven't already
No,
touched upon?
we've done enough. That's a lot. That's already a head spinner. Like I
Okay.
said, between now and the end of the year, 2 very informative data sets in oncology and 1 very informative data set in obesity. That is plenty.
Right. So we've got the ASCO data coming out sometime the end of May 29th to June 2. That's the monotherapy in head and neck and cervical cancer. We've got, I guess, late summer. You're going to get your 12-week obesity study with CRB-913, and that's going to be big for the reasons we've just talked about. You're going to initiate your registrational trial in CRB-701 in the treatment of head and neck, I think this summer. And then at the end of the year, we're going to see some combination data with CRB-701 and Keytruda, I guess, in support of first-line head and neck squamous cell carcinoma. That's a big year ahead of you.
That's a lot.
Terrific. So I've got my disclaimer comments. So this podcast was for informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice. Corbus is a pre-commercial stage biotech company that, while potentially promising, should be considered a high-risk investment. And please consult your professional investment advisor as to whether Corbus is a suitable investment for you. And finally, I am independent of Corbus and am not being compensated by them for making this podcast. So, Yuval, thank you so much. This was a terrific discussion, and I certainly learned a lot, and I hope our listeners did as well.
Thank you so much, and thank you to your listeners. I hope they find it of interest. Um, and Stephen, thank you for being my first ever podcast. I really enjoyed it. It was a fun conversation.
It was my pleasure. Thanks, Yuval.
Take care. All the best. Bye bye.